Welcome, I am Daisy, your hostess. In this video, we're going to be reading the book titled Reincarnation and the Law of Karma, a study of the old New World doctrine of rebirth and spiritual cause and effect by William Walker Atkinson. There are a few topics that the author is going to touch on, such as how long between incarnations, what happens at death, the great astral world and its planes and subplanes. Where does the soul go after death? And what it does there? What are the rebirth and its laws? And what is the final state of the soul? He's also going to talk about justice as it relates to reincarnation, such as, does the law of karma automatically enforce itself, or is everyone their own judge and executioner of their own destiny? And he's going to make an argument for reincarnation. So, I don't know about you, but like I've mentioned in the previous videos, I've had a near-death experience, and I'm not going to go into all the details into this video, so please do, if you go to my playlist and catch the first few chapters, I have it in there. But in argument for, is there something more after this existence in our flesh? I have an experience, and there is more. Now, because I wasn't privy or had an opportunity to engage in the query while I was in this other realm, I could tell you that I don't know about reincarnation. I just know that the paramedics resuscitated me, and I was back here. I do tell you that there is something about the essence, because I didn't have a body. It was just, I was aware of me, and I was also aware of almost everyone around me. It was amazing experience, and this beautiful illuminating light that was so brilliant, and the energy was just pure love, and I was drawn to it. But unfortunately, I was pushed back here because it said that I had not finished my work. And the thing is that I didn't have a body, but I was communicating, so it was weird. So I can only speak of that, but I don't know beyond that. And I was given the breath of life by the paramedics, so just came back into the same body. And do we know about reincarnation because it's an instinct? I mean, what do you think? Do you think that we come back living many lives? What is the point of coming back with so many lives? If we have been engendered from something so beautiful as that radiating light, then why can we recognize when something is not beautiful and kind and of these higher virtues, right? And the imbalance of poverty and the struggle and this animal nature of us that goes so low as to murder and rob or rape. Is that part of that engendered light? Why would that be in us? Wouldn't we just be all this radiant light? But that's not so. What is the purpose of this? Even if it's one lifetime, what is the purpose of this? I don't know. I am looking forward to your comments, and also what else does the author have to say as we continue to the next chapter. Reincarnation and the Law of Karma, a study of the old New World doctrine of rebirth and spiritual cause and effect by William Walker Atkinson, Chapter 7. Between and Beyond Incarnations. One of the first questions usually asked by students of the subject of reincarnation is, where does the soul dwell between incarnations? Does it incarnate immediately after death? And what is its final abode or state? This question or questions have been asked from the beginning, and probably will be asked so long as the human mind dwells upon the subject. And many are the answers that have been given to the questioners by the teachers and authorities upon the subject. Let us consider some of the leading and more authoritative answers. In the first place, let us consider the phase of the question which asks, does the soul incarnate immediately after death? Some of the earlier reincarnationists believed and taught that the soul reincarnated shortly after death, the short period between incarnations being used by the soul in adjusting itself, striking a balance of character, and preparing for a new birth. Others held that there was a period of waiting and rest between incarnations in which the soul mentally digested the experiences of the last life just completed, and then considered and meditated over the mistakes it had made, and determined to rectify the mistakes in the next life. It being held that when the soul was relieved of the necessities of material existence, it could think more clearly of the moral nature of its acts, and would be able to realize the spiritual side of itself more distinctly, in addition to having the benefit of the spiritual perspective occasioned by its distance from the active scenes of life, and thus being able to better gauge the respective worthwhileness of the things of material life. At the present time, the most advanced students of the subject hold that the average period of rest between incarnations is about 1,500 years, the less advanced souls hastening back to Earth in a very short time, the more advanced preferring a long period of rest, meditation, and preparation for a new life. It is held that the soul of a gross, material, animal-like person will incarnate very shortly after death, the period of rest and meditation being very short, for the reason that there is very little about which such a soul could meditate, as all of its attractions and desires are connected with material life. Many souls are so earth-bound that they rush back at once into material embodiment if the conditions for rebirth are favorable, and they are generally favorable, for there seems to be always an abundant supply of new bodies suitable for such souls and the families of people of the same character and nature, which afford congenial opportunities for such a soul to reincarnate. Other souls which have progressed a little further along the path of attainment have cultivated the higher part of themselves somewhat, and enjoy to a greater extent the period of meditation and spiritual life afforded them. And so, as the scale advances, as the attraction for material life grows less, the period of purely spiritual existence between incarnation grows longer. And it is said that the souls of persons who are highly developed spiritually sometimes dwell in the state of rest for 10,000 years or more, unless they voluntarily return sooner in order to take part in the work of uplifting the world. It must be remembered, in this connection, that the best teaching is to the effect that the advanced souls are rapidly unfolding into the state in which they are enabled to preserve consciousness in future births, instead of losing it, as is the usual case, and thus they take a conscious part in the selection of the conditions for rebirth, which is wisely denied persons of a more material nature and less spiritual development. The next phase of question: where does the soul dwell between incarnations? Is one still more difficult to answer, owing to the various shades of opinion on the subject. Still, there is a fundamental agreement between the different schools, and we shall try to give you the essence or cream of the thought on the subject. In the first place, all occultists set aside any idea of there being a place in which the souls dwell, the existence of states or planes of existence being deemed sufficient for the purpose. It is held that there are many planes of existence in any and every portion of space, which planes interpenetrate each other, so that entities dwelling on one plane usually are not conscious of the presence of those on another plane. Thus, an inhabitant of a high plane of being, in which the vibrations of substance are much higher than that which we occupy, would be able to pass through our material world without the slightest knowledge of its existence, just as the X-rays pass through the most solid object, or as a light passes through the air. It is held that there are many planes of existence much higher than the one we occupy, and upon which the disembodied souls dwell. There are many details regarding these planes, taught by the different schools of occultism or spiritualism, but we have neither the time nor the space to consider them at length, and must content ourselves with mentioning but a few leading or typical beliefs or teachings on the subject. The Theosophists teach that just when the soul leaves the body, there occurs a process of psychic photography in which the past life, in all of its details, is inevitably imprinted on the inner substance of the soul, thus preserving a record independent of the brain, the latter being left behind in the physical body. Then the astral body, or etheric double, detaches itself from the body, from which the vital force, or prana-jiva, also departs at the same time. The astral body enfolding also the 4 other principles, and together the 5 surviving principles pass on to the plane of Kamaloka, or the astral plane of desire. Kamaloka is that part of the astral plane nearest to the material plane and is very closely connected with the latter. If the soul is filled with hot and earnest desire for earth life, it may proceed no further, but may hasten back to material embodiment, as we said a moment ago. But if the soul has higher aspirations and has developed the higher part of itself, it presses on further, in which case the astral body and the animal soul, which is the seat of the passions and grosser desires, disintegrate and thus release the triad, or threefold higher nature of the soul, namely the higher human soul, the spiritual soul, and the spirit, or as some term them, the intellect, the spiritual mind, and the spirit. The triad then passes on to what is known as the plane of Devachan, where it rests divested of the lower parts of its nature and in a state of bliss, and in a condition in which it may make great progress by reason of meditation, reflection, etc. Kamaloka has been compared to the purgatory of the Catholics, which it resembles in more ways than one, according to the Theosophist. Devachan is sometimes called the heaven world by Theosophists, the word meaning the state or plane of the gods. Theosophy teaches that the soul triad dwells in Devachan for a period proportionate to the merit of the being, and from whence in the proper time the being is drawn down again to be reborn in the world of mortals. The law of karma, which rules the earth life of man and which regulates the details of his rebirth, is said to operate on the Devachanic plane as well, thus deciding the time of his abode on that plane and the time when the soul shall proceed to rebirth. The state of existence in Devachan is described at length in the Theosophical writings, but is too complex for full consideration here. Briefly stated, it may be said that it is taught that the life on Devachan is in the nature of a dream of the best that is in us, that is, a condition in which the highest that is in us is given a chance for expression and growth and development. The state of the soul in Devachan is said to be one of bliss, the degree depending upon the degree of spiritual development of the soul, as the bliss is of an entirely spiritual nature. It may be compared to a state of people listening to some beautiful music. The greater the music development of the person, the greater will be his degree of enjoyment. It is also taught that just as the soul leaves Devachan to be reincarnated, it is given a glimpse of its past lives and its present character, that it may realize the karmic relations between the cause and effect, to the end that its new life may be improved upon. Then it sinks into a state of unconsciousness and passes on to rebirth. The Western school of the yogi philosophy gives an idea of the state between incarnations, somewhat eclectic in its origin, agreeing with the Theosophical teaching in some respects and differing from it in others. Let us take a hasty glance at it. In the first place, it does not use the terms Kamaloka and Devachan respectively, but instead treats the whole series of planes as the great astral world containing many planes, divisions, and subdivisions, many subplanes and divisions of the same. The teaching is that the soul passes out of the body, leaving behind its physical form, together with its prana or vital energy, and taking with it the astral body, the instructive mind, and the higher principles. The last vision of the past life, in which the events of that life are impressed upon the soul just as it leaves the body, is held to be a fact. The soul sees the past life as a whole and in all of its minutest details at the moment of death, and it is urged that the dying person should be left undisturbed in his last moments for this reason. and that the soul may become calm and peaceful when starting on its journey. On one of the astral planes, the soul gradually discards its astral body and its instinctive mind, but retains its higher vehicles or sheaths. But it is taught that this discarding of the lower sheaths occurs after the soul has passed into a soul slumber on a subplane of the astral world, from which it awakens to find itself clothed only in its higher mental and spiritual garments of being, and free from the grosser coverings and burdens. The teachings say, when the soul has cast off the confining sheaths and has reached the state for which it is prepared, it passes to the plane in the astral world for which it is fitted and to which it is drawn by the law of attraction. The planes of the astral world interpenetrate, and souls dwelling on one plane are not conscious of those dwelling on another, nor can they pass from one plane to another, with this exception, that those dwelling on a higher plane are able to see, if they so desire, the planes below them in the order of development, and are able to visit these lower planes if they so desire. But those on the lower planes are not able to either see or visit the planes above them. Not that there is a watchman at the gate to prevent them, but for the same reason that a fish is not able to pass from the water to the plane of air above the water. The same teachings tell us that the souls on the higher planes often visit friends and relatives on the lower, so that there's always the opportunity for loved ones, relatives, and friends meeting in this way. And also many souls on the higher planes pass to the lower planes in order to instruct and advise those dwelling on the latter. The result that in some cases there may be a progression from a lower to a higher plane of the astral world by promotion earned by this instruction. Regarding rebirth from the astral world, the teachings say, quote, "But sooner or later, the souls feel a desire to gain new experiences and to manifest in earth life some of the advancement which has come to them since death, and for these reasons, and from the attraction of desires which have been smoldering there, not lived out or cast off, or possibly influenced by the fact that some loved soul on a lower plane is ready to incarnate and wishing to be incarnated at the same time in order to be with it, which is also a desire, the souls fall into the current sweeping toward rebirth, and the selection of proper parents and advantageous circumstances and surrounding, and in consequence again fall into a soul slumber gradually, and so when their time comes they die to the plane upon which they have been existing and are born into a new physical life and body. A soul does not fully awaken from its sleep immediately at birth, but exists in a dreamlike state during the days of infancy, its gradual awakening being evidenced by the growing intelligence of the babe, the brain of the child keeping pace with the demands made upon it. In some cases, the awakening is premature, and we see cases of prodigies, child geniuses, etc., but such cases are more or less abnormal and unhealthy. Occasionally, the dreaming soul in the child half awakes and startles us by some profound observation or mature remark or conduct. The third phase of the question: what is the final state or abode of the soul? Is one that reaches to the very center or heart of philosophical and religious thought and teaching. Each philosophy and religion has its own explanation or interpretation of the truth, and it is not for us to attempt to select one teaching from the many in this work. The reader will find many references to these various explanations and teachings as he reads the several chapters of this book, and he may use his own discrimination and judgment in selecting that which appeals to him the most strongly. But he will notice that there is a fundamental agreement between all the teachings and beliefs. The principle that the movement of the soul is ever upward and onward, and that there is no standing still in spiritual development and unfoldment. Whether the end, if end there be, is the reaching of a state of bliss in the presence of the Divine One, or whether the weary soul finds rest in the bosom of the Father by what has been called union with God. The vital point for the evolving soul is that there is a better day coming, a haven of rest around the turn of the road. And whatever may be the details of the truth, the fact remains that whatever state awaits the soul finally, it must be good and in accordance with divine wisdom and ultimate justice and universal love. The majority of occultists look forward to an end in the sense of being absorbed in the divine being, not in the sense of annihilation, but in the sense of reaching a consciousness of the whole in the whole. This is the true meaning of nirvana. But whether this be true, or whether there is a place of final rest in the highest spiritual realms other than in the sense of absorption in the divine, or whether there is a state of eternal progression from plane to plane, from realm to realm, on, forever Godward and more God-like, the end must be good, and there is nothing to fear. For the power that rules here, rules there, and everywhere. And remember this, ye seekers after ultimate truths, the highest authorities inform us that even the few stages or planes just ahead of us in the journey are so far beyond our present powers of conception that they are practically unknowable to us. This being so, it will be seen that states very much nearer to us than the end must be utterly beyond the powers not only of our understanding, but also of our imagination, even when strained to its utmost. This being so, why should we attempt to speculate about the end? Instead, why not say with Newman, quote, I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me, lead thou me on, end quote. It is said that when Thoreau was dying, a friend leaned over and taking him by the hand said, Henry, you are so near to the border now, can you see anything on the other side? And the dying Thoreau replied, one world at a time, Parker. And this seems to be the great lesson of life, one plane at a time. But though the veil of Isis is impossible of being lifted entirely, still there is a sometimes that enables one to see, at least dimly, the features of the goddess behind the veil. And that something is that intelligent faith that knows, although it is unable to explain even to itself. And the voice of that something within informs him who has that faith. All is well, brother. For beyond planes and states and universes and time and space and name and form and things, there must be that which transcends them all, and from which they all proceed. Though we may not know what that is, the fact that it must exist, that it is a sufficient guarantee that the law is in constant operation on all planes, from the lowest to the highest, and the cosmos is governed by the law. And this being so, not even an atom may be destroyed, nor misplaced, nor suffer injustice, and all will attain the end rightly, and know the Satchit Ananda of the Hindus, the being, wisdom, bliss, absolute, that all philosophies and religions agree upon is the final state of the blessed. And to the occultist, all are blessed, even to the last soul in the scale of life. And over all the tumult and strife of life, there's always that something, that, silently brooding and watching and waiting, the life, light, and love of the all. Such is the message of the illumined of all ages, races, and lands. Is it not worthy of our attention and consideration? End of chapter. Chapter 8. The Justice of Reincarnation. There are three views entertained by men who believe in the existence of the soul. There are many shades of belief and opinion on the subject, but they may be divided into three classes. These three views, respectively, are as follows. 1. That the soul is specially created by the Supreme Power at the time of conception or birth, and that its position on earth, its circumstance, its degree of intelligence, etc., are fixed arbitrarily by that power for some inscrutable reason of its own. 2. That the soul was pre-existent, that is, that it existed before conception and birth in some higher state not understood by us, from whence it was thrust into human form and birth, its position on earth, its circumstances, its degree of intelligence, etc., being determined by causes unknown to us. 3. That the soul is one of the countless others which emanated from the source of being at some period in the past, and which souls were equal in power, intelligence, opportunity, etc., and which worked its way up by spiritual evolution from lowly forms of expression and life to its present state, from whence it is desired to move on to higher and still higher forms and states of existence, until in the end, after millions of aeons of existence in the highest planes of expressed life, it will again return to the source of being from which it emanated and becomes one with the Father, not in a state of annihilated consciousness, but in a condition of universal consciousness with all. This view holds that the present conditions of each soul is due to its own progress, development, advancement, unfoldment, or the lack of the same, the soul being its own fate and destiny, the enforcer of the law upon itself under the law of karma. Considering the first named view, namely that the soul is newly created and that its condition has been arbitrarily fixed by the divine power, the student free from prejudice or fear finds it difficult to escape the conclusion that under this plan of creation there is lacking a manifestation of divine justice. Even admitting the inability of the finite mind to fully grasp infinite principles, man is still forced to the realization of manifest inequality and injustice of the relative positions of human beings on earth, providing that the same is thrust arbitrarily upon them. And it would seem that no amount of future reward would possibly equalize or explain these conditions. Unless there be something back of it all, it would certainly seem that injustice was manifested. Of course, many argue that the idea of justice has nothing to do with the universal processes, but all who think of divine being, filled with love and justice, are compelled to think that such qualities must manifest themselves in the creations of such a being. And if there be nothing back of it all, then the candid observer must confess that the scheme of justice manifested is most faulty according even to the human imperfect idea of justice. As Figuier, a French writer, said about 40 years ago, "If there are a few men well organized, of good constitution and robust health, how many are infirm, idiotic, deaf-mute, blind from birth, maimed, foolish, and insane? My brother is handsome and well-shaped. I am ugly, weakly, rickety, and a hunchback. Yet we are sons of the same mother. Some are born into opulence, others into the most dreadful want. Why am I not a prince and a great lord, instead of a poor pilgrim on the earth, ungrateful and rebellious? Why was I born in Europe and at Paris, whereby civilization and art life is rendered supportable and easy, instead of seeing the light under the burning skies of the tropics, where, dressed out in a beastly muzzle, a skin black and oily, and locks of wool, I should have been exposed to the double torments of a deadly climate and a barbarous society? Why is it not a wretched African Negro in my place in Paris, in conditions of comfort? We have, either of us, done nothing to entitle us to our assigned places. We have invited neither this favor nor that disgrace. Why is the unequal distribution of the terrible evils that fall upon some men and spare others? How have those deserved the partiality of fortune who live in happy lands, while many of their brethren suffer and weep in other parts of the world?" Figuier continues, "Some men are endowed with all benefits of mind. Others, on the contrary, are devoid of intelligence, penetration, and memory. They stumble at every step in their rough life paths. Their limited intelligence and their imperfect faculties expose them to all possible mortifications and disasters. They can succeed in nothing, and fate seems to have chosen them for the constant objects of its most deadly blows. There are beings who, from the moment of their birth to the hour of their death, utter only cries of suffering and despair. What crime have they committed? Why are they here on earth? They have not petitioned to be here, and if they could, they would have begged that this fatal cup might be taken from their lips. They are here in spite of themselves, against their will. God would be unjust and wicked if he imposed so miserable an existence upon beings who have done nothing to incur it, and have not asked for it. But God is not unjust or wicked. The opposite qualities belong to his perfect essence. Therefore, the presence of man on such or such parts of the earth, and the unequal distribution of evil on our globe, must remain unexplained. If you know a doctrine, a philosophy, or a religion that solves these difficulties, I will destroy this book and confess myself vanquished. The Orthodox theology answers Figuier's question by the argument that, in our finite understanding, we cannot pretend to understand God's plan, purposes, and designs, nor to criticize his form of justice. It holds that we must look beyond that mortal life for the evidence of God's love, and not attempt to judge it according to what we see here on earth of men's miseries and inequalities. It holds that the suffering and misery come to us as an inheritance from Adam, and as a result of the sins of our first parents, but that if we are good, it will all be evened up and recompensed in the next world. Of course, the extremists who hold to predestination have held that some were happy and some miserable, simply because God, in the exercise of his will, had elected and predestined them to those conditions. But it would scarcely be fair to quote this as the position of current theology, because the tendency of modern theological thought is away from that conception. We mention it merely as showing what some have thought of the subject. Others have sought refuge in the idea that we suffer for the sins of our parents, according to the old doctrine that the sins of the parents shall be visited upon the children. But even this is not in accordance with man's highest idea of justice and love. Passing on to the second view, namely that the soul was pre-existent, that is, existed in some higher state not understood by us, from whence it was thrust into human form, etc., we note that the questions as to the cause of inequality, misery, etc., considered a moment ago, are still actively with us. This view does not straighten out this question at all, for whether the soul was pre-existent in a higher state, or whether it was freshly created, the fact remains that as souls they must be equal in the sense of being made by the same process, and from the same material, and that up to the point of their embodiment, they had not sinned or merited any reward or punishment, nor had they earned anything one way or another. And yet, according to the theory, these equally innocent and inexperienced souls are born, some being thrust into the bodies of children to be born in environments conducive to advancement, development, etc., and gifted with natural advantages, while others are thrust into bodies of children to be born into the most wretched environments and surroundings and devoid of many natural advantages, not to speak of the crippled, deformed, and pain-ridden ones in all the walks of life. There is no more explanation of the problem in this view than there was in the first mentioned one. Passing on to the third view, namely that the soul is one of the countless others which emanated from the source of being aeons ago, equal in power, opportunities, etc., and which individual soul has worked its way up to its present position through many rebirths and lives, in which it has gained many experiences and lessons, which determine its present condition, and which in turn will profit by the experiences and lessons of the present life by which the next stage of its life will be determined. We find what many have considered to be the only logical and possible explanation of the problem of life's inequalities, providing there is an answer at all, and that there is any such thing as a soul and a loving, just God. Figuier, the French writer, from whom we quoted that remarkable passage breathing the pessimism of the old view of life a few moments ago, admitted that in rebirth was to be found a just explanation of the matter. He says, if, on the contrary, we admit the plurality of human existences and reincarnation, that is, the passage of the same soul through several bodies, all this is made wonderfully clear. Our presence on such a part of the earth is no longer the effect of caprice or fate, or the result of chance. It is merely a station in the long journey that we make through the world. Before our birth we have already lived, and this life is the sequel and result of previous ones. We have a soul that we must purify, improve, and ennoble during our stay upon earth. Or having already completed an imperfect and wicked life, we are compelled to begin a new one, and thus strive to rise to the level of those who have passed on to higher planes. The advocates of reincarnation point out that the idea of justice is fully carried out in that view of life, inasmuch as what we are is determined by what we have been, and what we shall be is determined by what we are now, and that we are constantly urged on by the pressure of the unfolding spirit and attracted upward by the Divine One. Under this conception, there is no such thing as chance. All is according to law. As an ancient Grecian philosopher once said, without the doctrine of metempsychosis, it is not possible to justify the ways of God. And many other philosophers and theologians have followed him in this thought. If we enjoy, we have earned it. If we suffer, we have earned it. In both cases, through our own endeavors and efforts, and not by chance, nor by reason of the merits or demerits of our forefathers, nor because of predestination nor election to that fate. If this be true, then one is given the understanding to stoically bear the pains and miseries of this life without cursing fate or imputing injustice to the divine. And likewise, he is given an incentive toward making the best of his opportunities now, in order to pass on to higher and more satisfactory conditions in future lives. Reincarnationists claim that rewards and punishments are properly awarded only on the plane in which the deed, good or bad, was committed, else their nature is changed, their effects impaired, and their collateral bearings lost. A writer on the subject has pointed out this fact in the following words: physical outrage has to be checked by the infliction of physical pain, and not merely by the arousing of internal regret. Honest lives find appropriate consequence in visible honor. But one career is too short for the precise balancing of accounts, and many are needed that every good or evil done in each may be requited on the earth where it took place. In reference to this mention of rewards and penalties, we would say that very many advanced reincarnationists do not regard the conditions of life as rewards and punishments, but on the contrary, look upon them as forming part of the lessons in the kindergarten of life, to be learned and profited by in future lives. We shall speak of this further in our consideration of the question of karma. The difference is vital and should be closely observed in considering the subject. Before we pass from the consideration of the question of justice as exemplified by reincarnation, we would call your attention to the difference in the views of life and its rewards and punishments held by the Orthodox theologians and the reincarnationists, respectively. On the one hand, the Orthodox theologians hold that for the deeds, good or evil, performed by a man during his short lifetime of a few years, and then performed under conditions arbitrarily imposed upon him at birth by his Creator, man is rewarded or punished by an eternity of happiness or misery, heaven or hell. Perhaps the man has lived but 1 or 2 years of reasonable understanding, or full 70, and has violated certain moral, ethical, or even religious laws, perhaps only to the extent of refusing to believe something that his reason absolutely refused to accept. For this he is doomed to an everlasting sojourn in a place of pain, misery, or punishment, or a state of equivalent thereto. Or, on the other hand, he has done the things that he ought to have done, and left undone the things that he ought not to have done, even though this doing and not doing was made very easy for him by reason of his environment and surroundings. And to crown his beautiful life, he had accepted the orthodox creeds and beliefs of his fathers as a matter of course, then this man is rewarded by an eternity of bliss, happiness, and joy without end. Try to think of what eternity means. Think of the aeons upon aeons of time, on and on and on, forever. And the poor sinner is suffering exquisite torture all the time, and in all time to come, without limit, respite, without mercy. And all the same time, the good man is enjoying his blissful state without limit or end or satiety. And the time of probation, during which the two worked out their future fate, was as a grain of sand as compared with the countless universes in space in all eternity. A relation which reduces the span of man's lifetime to almost absolutely nothing, mathematically considered. Think of this. Is this justice? And on the other hand, from the point of view of the reincarnationist, is not the measure of cause and effect more equitably adjusted, even if we regard it as a matter of reward and punishment? A crude view, by the way, when we see that every infraction of the law is followed by a corresponding effect, and an adherence to the law by a proportionate effect. Does not the punishment fit the crime better in this case? The rewards also? And looking at it from a reasonable point of view, devoid from theological bias, which plan seems to be the best exemplification of justice and natural law, not to speak of the higher divine justice and cosmic law? Of course, we are not urging these ideas as proofs of reincarnation, for strictly speaking, proof must lie outside of speculation of what ought to be. Proof belongs to the region of what is and facts in experience. But nevertheless, while one is considering the matter, it should be viewed from every possible aspect in order to see how it works out. It is also urged along the lines of the justice of reincarnation, as opposed to the injustice of the contrary doctrine, that there are many cases of little infants who have only a few days or minutes of this life before they pass out of the body in death. According to the anti-reincarnation doctrine, these little souls have been freshly created and placed into physical bodies, and then, without having had a taste of the experiences of life, are ushered into the higher planes, there to pass an eternal existence, while other souls have to live out their long lives of earth in order to reach the same higher states, and then, according to the prevailing doctrine, even then they may have earned eternal punishment instead of eternal bliss. According to this idea, the happiest fate would be for all to die as infants, providing we were baptized, some good souls would add, and the death of an infant should be the occasion for the greatest rejoicing on the part of those who love it. But in spite of the doctrine, human nature does not so act. According to the doctrine of reincarnation, the little babe soul was but pursuing the same path as the rest of the race, if it had its past, according to law and justice. While if the ordinary view be correct, no one would begrudge the infant its happy fate. Still one would have a good cause for complaint, as the inequality and injustice of others having to live out long lives of pain, discomfort, and misery for no cause, instead of being at once translated into a higher life, as was the infant. If the ordinary view be true, then why the need of earth life at all? Why not create a soul and then place it in the heavenly realms at once? If it is possible and proper in some cases, why not in all? If the experience is not indispensable, then why impose it on certain souls when all are freshly created and equal in merit and deserts? If earthly life has any virtue, then the infant's soul is robbed of its right. If earthly life has no virtue, the adult souls are forced to live a useless existence on earth, running the risk of damnations if they fail, while the infant souls escape this. Is this equality of opportunity and experience, or justice? There would seem to be something wrong with either the facts or the theory. Test the problem with the doctrine of reincarnation and see how it works out. End of chapter. Chapter 9. The Argument for Reincarnation. In addition to the consideration of justice, there are many other advantages claimed by the advocates of reincarnation which are worthy of the careful consideration of students of the problem of the soul. We shall give to each of these principal points a brief consideration in this chapter, that you may acquaint yourself with the several points of the argument. It is argued that the principle of analogy renders it more reasonable to believe that the present life of the soul is but one link in a great chain of existences, which chain stretches far back into the past on one side and far out into the future on the other, than to suppose that it has been specially created for this petty term of a few years of earth life, and then projected for weal or woe into an eternity of spiritual existence. It is argued that the principle of evolution on the physical plane points to an analogy of evolution of the spiritual plane. It is reasoned that just as birth on the next plane of life follows death on the present one, so analogy would indicate that a death on past planes preceded birth on this, and so on. It is argued that every form of life that we know of has arisen from lower forms, which in turn arose from still lower forms, and so on. And that following the same analogy, the soul has risen from lower to higher, and will mount on to still higher forms and planes. It is argued that special creation is unknown in the universe, and that it is far more reasonable to apply the principle of evolution to the soul than to consider it as an exception and violation of the universal law. It is also claimed by some thinkers that the idea of future existence presupposes past existence, for everything that is begun must end sometime, and therefore if we are to suppose that the soul is to continue its existence in the future, we must think of it as having an existence in the past, being eternal at both ends of the earth life, as it were. Opponents of the idea of immortality are fond of arguing that there was no more reason for supposing that a soul would continue to exist after the death of the body than there was for supposing that it had existed previously. A well-known man once was asked the question, "What becomes of a man's soul after death?" When he evaded the question by answering, "It goes back to where it came from." And to many, this idea had seemed sufficient to make them doubt the idea of immortality. The ancient Greek philosophers felt it logically necessary for them to assert the eternal preexistence of the soul in order to justify their claim of future existence for it. They argued that if the soul is immortal, it must have always existed, for an immortal thing could not have been created. If it was not immortal by nature, it could never be made so, and if it was immortal by nature, then it had always existed. The argument usually employed is this: a thing is either mortal or immortal, one or the other. If it is mortal, it has been born and must die. If it is immortal, it cannot have been born, neither can it die. Mortality means subject to life and death. Immortality means immunity from both. The Greeks devoted much time and care to this argument, and they attached great importance to it. They reasoned that nothing that possessed reality could have emerged from nothingness, nor could it pass into nothingness. If it were real, it was eternal. If it was not eternal, it was not real, and would pass away even as it was born. They also claimed that the sense of immortality possessed by the ego was an indication of its having experienced life in the past, as well as anticipating life in the future. There is a sense of oldness pervading every thought of the soul regarding its own nature. It is claimed as an illogical assumption to hold that back of the present there extends an eternity of non-existence for the soul, while ahead of it there extends an eternity of being. It is held that it is far more logical to regard the present life as merely a single point in an eternity of existence. It is argued further that reincarnation fits in with the known scientific principle of conservation of energy. That is, that no energy is ever created or is lost, but that all energy is but a form of the universal energy which flows on from form to form, from manifestation to manifestation, ever the same, and yet manifesting in myriad forms, never born, never dying, but always moving on and on and on to new manifestations. Therefore, it is thought that it is reasonable to suppose that the soul follows the same law of re-embodiment, rising higher and higher throughout time, until finally it re-enters the universal spirit from which it emerged, and in which it will continue to exist as it existed before it emerged for the cycle of manifestation. It is also argued that reincarnation brings life within the law of cause and effect, just as is everything else in the universe. The law of rebirth, according to the causes generated during past lives, would bring the existence of the soul within and in harmony with the natural laws, instead of without and contrary to them. It is further argued that the feeling of original sin, of which so many people assert as a consciousness, may be explained better by the theory of reincarnation than by any theological doctrine. The orthodox doctrine is that original sin was something inherited from Adam by reason of our forefathers' transgression. But this jars upon the thought of today, as well it might. For what has the soul to do with Adam? It did not descend from him, or from aught else but the source of being. There is no line of descent for souls, though there may be for bodies. What has Adam to do with your soul, if it came fresh from the mint of the Maker, pure and unsullied? How could his sin taint your new soul? Theology here asserts either arrant nonsense or else grave injustice. But if for Adam we substitute our past existences and the thoughts and deeds thereof, we may understand that feeling of conscience recognition of past wrongdoing and remorse, which so many testify to, though they be reasonably free from the same in the present life. The butterfly dimly remembers its worm state, and although it now soars, it feels the slime of the mud in which it once crawled. It is also argued that in one life the soul would fail to acquire the varied experience which is necessary to form a well-rounded mentality of understanding. Dwarfed by its limited experience in the narrow sphere occupied by many human beings, it would be far from acquiring the knowledge which would seem to be necessary for a developed and advanced soul. Besides this, there would be as great an inequality on the part of souls after death as there is before death. Some would pass it into the future state as ignorant beings, while others would possess a full nature of understanding. As a leading authority has said, a perfected man must have experienced every type of earthly relation and duty, every phase of desire, affection, and passion, every form of temptation, and every variety of conflict. No one life can possibly furnish the material for more than a minute section of such experience. Along the same line, it is urged that the soul's development must come largely from contact and relationship with other souls in a variety of phases and forms. It must experience pain and happiness, love, pity, failure, success. It must know the discipline of sympathy, toleration, patience, energy, fortitude, foresight, gratitude, pity, benevolence, and love in all of its phases. This, it is urged, is possible only through repeated incarnations, as the span of one life is too small, and its limits too narrow to embrace but a small fraction of the necessary experiences of the soul on its journey toward development and attainment. One must feel the sorrows and joys of all forms of life before understanding may come. Narrowness, lack of tolerance, prejudice, and similar forms of undeveloped consciousness must be wiped out by the broad understanding and sympathy that come only from experience. It is argued that only by repeated incarnations the soul is able to realize the futility of the search for happiness and satisfaction in material things. One, while dissatisfied and disappointed at his own condition, is apt to imagine that in some other earthly condition he would find satisfaction and happiness now denied him, and dying carries with him the subconscious desire to enjoy those conditions, which desire attracts him back to earth life in search of those conditions. So long as the soul desires anything that earth can offer, it is earthbound and drawn back into the vortex. But after repeated incarnation, the soul learns well its lessons that only in itself may be found happiness, and that only when it learns its real nature, source, and destiny, and then it passes on to higher planes. As an authority says, in time, the soul sees that a spiritual being cannot be nourished on inferior food, and that any joy short of union with the divine must be illusionary. It is also argued that but few people, as we see them in earth life, have realized the existence of a higher part of their being, and still fewer have asserted the supremacy of the higher and subordinated the lower part of the self to that higher. Were they to pass on to a final state of being after death, they would carry with them all their lower propensities and attributes, and would be utterly incapable of manifesting the spiritual part of their nature, which alone would be satisfied and happy in the spiritual realms. Therefore, it needs to be repeated lives in order to evolve from the lower conditions and to develop and unfold the higher. Touching upon the question of unextinguished desire, mentioned a moment ago, the following quotation from a writer on the subject gives clearly and briefly the reincarnationist argument regarding this point. The writer says, "Desire for other forms of earthly experience can only be extinguished by undergoing them. It is obvious that any one of us, if now translated to the unseen world, would feel regret that he had not tasted existence in some other situation or surroundings. He would wish to have known what it was to possess wealth and rank, or beauty, or to live in a different race or climate, or to see more of the world and society. No spiritual ascent could progress while earthly longings were dragging back the soul, and so it frees itself from them by successively securing them and dropping them. When the round of such knowledge has been traversed, regret for ignorance has died out. This idea of living out and outliving is urged by a number of writers and thinkers on the subject. J.W.M. Lloyd says in his Dawn Thought on this subject, "You rise and overcome simply by the natural process of living fully and thus outliving. As a child, it's milk teeth, a serpent is sloth. Living and outliving, that expresses it. Until you have learned the one lesson fully, you are never ready for a new one." The same writer in the same book also says, "By sin, shame, joy, virtue, and sorrow, action and reaction, attraction and repulsion, the soul, like a barbed arrow, ever goes on. It cannot go back or return through the valves of its coming. But this must not be understood to be fulfilled in one and every earth visit. It is true only of the whole circle voyage of the soul. In one earth trip, one life, as we say, it may be that there would nothing be but a standing still or a turning back, nothing but sin. But the whole course of all is on. But there is the danger of a misunderstanding of this doctrine, and some have misinterpreted and read it to advise a plunging into all kinds of sinful experience in order to live out and outlive, which idea is wrong, and cannot be entertained by any true student of the subjects, however much it may be used by those who wish to avail themselves of an excuse for material dissipation." Mabel Collins, in her notes to Light on the Path, says on this subject, "Seek it by testing all experience, and remember that, when I say this, I do not say, yield to the seduction of sense in order to know it. Before you have become an occultist, you may do this, but not afterwards. When you have chosen and entered the path, you cannot yield to these seductions without shame. Yet you can experience them without horror, can weigh, observe, and test them, and wait with the patience of confidence for the hour when they shall affect you no longer. But do not condemn a man that yields. Stretch out your hand to him as a brother, pilgrim, whose feet have become heavy with mire. Remember, O disciple, that great though the gulf may be between the good man and the sinner, it is greater between the good man and the man who has attained knowledge. It is immeasurable between the good man and the one on the threshold of divinity. Therefore, be wary lest too soon you fancy yourself a thing apart from the mass. And again, the same writer says, before you can attain knowledge, you must have passed through all places, foul and clean alike. Therefore, remember that the soiled garment you shrink from touching may have been yours yesterday, may be yours tomorrow. And if you turn with horror from it when it is flung upon your shoulders, it will cling the more closely to you. The self-righteous man makes for himself a bed of mire. Abstain because it is right to abstain, not that yourself shall be kept clean. It is also argued that reincarnation is necessary in order to give the evolving races a chance to perfect themselves, that is, not through their physical descendants, which would not affect the souls of those living in the bodies of the races today, but by perfection and growth of the souls themselves. It is pointed out that to usher a savage or barbarian to the spiritual planes after death, no matter how true to his duty and his lights the soul had been, would be to work an absurd translation. Such a soul would not be fitted for the higher spiritual planes and would be most unhappy and miserable there. It will be seen that reincarnationists make quite a distinction between goodness and achievement. While they recognize and urge the former, they regard it as only one side of the question, the other being spiritual growth and unfoldment. It will be seen that reincarnation provides for a spiritual evolution with all of its advantages, as well as a material evolution such as science holds to be correct. Concluding this chapter, let us quote once more from the authority on the subject before mentioned, who writes anonymously in the pamphlet from which the quotation is taken. He says, "Nature does nothing by leaps. She does not, in this case, introduce into a region of spirit and spiritual life a being who has known little sense than matter and material life, with small comprehension even of that. To do so would be analogous to transferring suddenly a plowboy into a company of metaphysicians. The pursuit of any topic implies some preliminary acquaintance with its nature, aims, and mental requirements. And the more elevated the topic, the more copious the preparation for it. It is inevitable that a being who has before him an eternity of progress through zones of knowledge and spiritual experience ever nearing the central sun should be fitted for it through long acquisition of the faculties which alone can deal with it. Their delicacy, their vigor, their penetrativeness, their unlikeness to those called for on the material plane show the contrast of the earth life to the spiritual life. And they show, too, the inconceivability of a sudden transition from one to the other, of a policy unknown in any other department of nature's workings, of a break in the law of uplifting through evolution. A man, before he can become a god, must first become a perfect man. And he can become a perfect man neither in 70 years of a life on earth, nor in any number of years of a life from which human conditions are absent. Rebirth and relife must go on till their purposes are accomplished. If indeed we were mere victims of an evolutionary law, helpless atoms on which the machinery of nature pitilessly played, the prospect of a succession of incarnations, no one of which gave satisfaction, might drive us to mad despair. But we have thrust on us no such cheerless exposition. We are shown that reincarnations are the law for man, because they are the conditions of his progress, which is also a law, but he may mold them and better them and lessen them. He cannot rid himself of the machinery, but neither should wish to. Endowed with the power to guide it for the best, promoted with the motive to use that power, he may harmonize both his aspirations and his efforts with the system that expressed the infinite wisdom of the Supreme. And through the journey from the temporal to the eternal tread the way with steady feet, braced with the consciousness that he is one of the innumerable multitude, and with the certainty that he and they alike, if they so will it, may attain finally to that sphere where birth and death are but memories of the past. In this chapter, we have given you a number of the arguments favorable to the doctrine of reincarnation from a number of sources. Some of these arguments do not specially appeal to us personally for the reason that they are rather more theological than scientific. But we have included them that the argument may appear as generally presented, and because we feel that in a work of this kind we must not omit an argument which is used by many of the best authorities simply because it may not appeal to our particular temperament or habit of thought. To some, the theological argument may appeal more strongly than would be the scientific, and it very properly is given here. The proper way to present any subject is to give it in its many aspects, and as it may appear from varied viewpoints. End of chapter. Meet me at the next video as we continue with the book titled Reincarnation and the Law of Karma. Like, share, and subscribe.